Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and today we are going deep, and we're going deep into neuroscience. Now, some of you don't study neuroscience or biology or understand some of this world, but we're all starting to appreciate more and more the power of how our minds work. As we talk about mental health in our society, there couldn't be anything more important than starting to recognize the way God's designed our minds to function, and how do we do that in the most creative of ways? How do we make sure we're operating in rhythms that bring out the best in how we think? We want to think well. It's part of our tagline at Q Ideas: stay curious, think well, and advance good. Well, today I'm going to interview in long form Curt Thompson. Dr. Curt Thompson is an incredible psychiatrist. He's also an author of several books, some of his most recent, The Soul of Shame, and then in the last few weeks, his new book, The Soul of Desire, Discovering the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty, and Community. We've loved having Dr. Curt Thompson as a part of our Q Ideas environments and retreats and many different spaces we invite leaders into to help us address and better understand what's happening to our minds. We did interview him recently at our Q&A event where we talked about mental health, suicide, and why is suicide becoming a real option for people. And he digs so deep into that. You can access that conversation that went on for 90 minutes at Q Media by going to qideas.org/trial to get a free trial. But in addition to that, we've partnered with Curt to launch a new podcast. How many times on a podcast are you hearing about another podcast? Well, here at Q Ideas, we're launching a new network of podcasts because we want you to have access to some of the greatest thought leaders and minds that we need for this moment to better understand how to navigate the future. And so we're launching Neurofaith with Dr. Curt Thompson, where he's bringing together this combination of great science and understanding how our minds are made into the real world of how our faith starts to impact that, and into the ways we're thinking about the world and how we operate in our emotional health, our physical health, our spiritual health. This first season will invite you to go into the depths of how our minds were meant to function and how we can think well about the culture we're in, about the way our minds are working, about the way our relationships work, about the ways we feel about God and spirituality. We're going to dig deep into that with Dr. Curt Thompson, so follow him. But today, I want you to listen in now as we have a conversation about the soul of shame and the soul of desire and the importance for us to recognize these key emotions and why God gave them to us and how they can start to help us better reflect His nature and His design for our life. Well, Dr. Curt Thompson, welcome to the Q Ideas podcast. It's good to have you today.
Oh, Gabe, thank you so much. As we were just a moment ago getting ready for this, it's just, not just great to be here and on the podcast, but it's really, really good to hear your voice. And I am going to enjoy the next few minutes as much just because I'm talking with you as much as the ideas that we're talking about. So,
well, you are kind, and everybody who knows you, and you've been around this community now for a few years where you've just been such a consistent, I would say, calming voice in the midst of a season where so many people have really been wringing their hands, trying to figure out what's going on inside their own minds, their own hearts, their own responses and reactions to what's happening in the world around us. And it's been such a chaotic couple of years, especially, that, God's just used you to help so many leaders I know, and so many people that listen and are part of these communities feel encouragement and feel their way through kind of navigating some of this. And it's so cool because I always love it when God's uniquely positioned somebody, giving them the experience, giving them the knowledge, the understanding, the wisdom prior to maybe a moment where it was going to be just demanded. And so you've helped so many of us. And so today's exciting because you've been working for many, many years on a new project that we're going to get into. But for people who don't really know your journey, catch us up and catch those up who don't know who you are and just kind of how you got into psychology, what your work has been for many, many years. And then I want to dig into some of the details here of the things I've been learning through you and that I hope others can learn.
Well, I think for me, life begins and ends. I think, for our listeners, an important thing to know is that my life begins and ends with my relationships that are closest to me. And so that is I'm married to a woman, Phyllis, 35 years this September, a woman that I don't deserve. And I have two children who are also who live radiant lives, but who also know what it means to really work hard to follow after Jesus. And so it has been deeply formative for me to be in these relationships and the friendships that I have. And I count even the work that I get to do relationally with you, Gabe, and with Rebecca and with others as being formational for me. So I say all that to say the work that I do for a living, which is as a psychiatrist, so, medical school and residency, and now seeing patients in a lot of different kinds of circumstances over the last 30 plus years. This, of course, has a lot to do with neuroscience and how the brain works and how the brain interacts with relationships. And it is also about this question of how does the brain in relationships, how does that interaction play itself out in the context of the biblical narrative? Because I think we like to say that anytime a patient comes to see me, that one of the things that we're really trying to do with them is not just relieve them of symptoms, but we're really trying to get them to help answer the question, in what story do I believe that I'm living, and how can I live more truly in the story that is really before me?
Mm-hmm. And this is so unique, Curt. I mean, this type of work that you do, a lot of places, they're only trying to relieve symptoms. They're only trying to ease people in their momentary crisis or pain. And you've taken just this much deeper look that that's not going to last if we don't get underneath it. How do your clients respond to that kind of approach? And do you find a lot of clients that come to you and they go, well, nobody's ever told me this, that there's more that I need to do besides just get medication, for example?
Right. And I think you're right. I think, it's crucially important to recognize that there is a role for the physical intervention in life. There's a role for pharmacology, for medication intervention. There is a role for even other kinds of medical interventions in psychiatric distress and disturbances. The challenge, I think, Gabe, is that so much of our psychiatric challenge has a lot to do with our trauma and has a lot to do with the way we have tried to cope with that and make sense of that. And that trauma isn't just something that happens to me in my own personal life, in my own mind. It is an event. We like to say that when it comes especially to our emotional distress, those traumatic events take place always in the context of intimate relationships. The most powerfully traumatizing things for us often are taking place in the context of the relationships with which we expect to have the most intimate safety. And so our listeners themselves can imagine in their own lives, in their own stories, plenty of places and ways in which trauma has emerged. And for many of us, I would say also, Gabe, many of us have had traumatic experiences that we wouldn't categorize as such. And because we don't think, because like I've not been in combat in Iraq, because I have not been systematically gang raped, if I haven't had some kind of major thing happen, I don't think of trauma as having had anything to do with my life. But we find that for many of us, our traumas come in very, very small, repetitive ways over the course of many, many decades. And I think that one of the things that neuroscience is really awakening us to and has helped reveal to us the way the brain works and all the different domains of the mind that I talk about in my first book, Anatomy of the Soul, a lot of that neuroscience really gives us a better understanding of the mechanics and the framework about how our relationships and our brain is working together. And when we are given that kind of information, we are then given ways of really addressing this. And of course, this then leads into the Soul of Shame, the book that came out about 6 years ago, in which what we're really trying to explore is this one particular human experience, this interpersonal neurobiological experience of shame that tends to, when we respond to it poorly, it tends to be the source of just about every possible thing that we could see that's wrong in our lives, in our culture, everything from my personal sense of just feeling awful about myself that I then work really hard to not pay attention to because I've got work to do and kids to raise and a business to run and a church to pastor and all the things. But when I don't pay attention to it, at some point my brain runs out of gas. And that's where we find that symptoms start to emerge. And, in our culture that is so apt to want to just simply solve a problem, and I want this problem solved quickly, that's where we can think, oh, I have this thing called depression, and so therefore I get medication. That somehow should be the ultimate solution to this, without really being aware even that there is a story underneath this that is worth exploring. But that story takes time, and it takes a connection to a community of people who are willing to walk with me in that regard. I think one of the things that I've really loved about the Q Ideas community has been, and with your leadership, in really inviting people to be curious. I mean, that whole phrase, stay curious.
Yeah.
Whether you know this or not, this is one of the most common phrases, that we've been using for years. One of those common things that we really train and invite our patients and our clinicians to really access. I really want to be curious about these parts of me that I find to be so painful, instead of just being judgmental of them and wishing that they would just go away.
Right, man. Well, the curiosity piece, I think, for all of us, and just the journey of exploring, asking questions, having like a healthy skepticism, is a really important piece of critical thinking and of us getting to the bottom of what's really going on. And your book, Soul of Shame, I was telling you earlier, Rebecca has read, marked that up, and it's kind of preached it to me and tried to help me understand it, but I couldn't understand it until I went through it myself. And it was so helpful and so deep. I was in a men's study just the other day, and one of the men was recommending it to the other men. He's like, you need to read this book, and telling them, like, this is such an important understanding to see how shame causes us to move towards isolation and away from relationship, when the actual solution is to move towards relationship. And so I know we won't be able to unpack that entirely here. I want people to go get that book, though, because I think it's so foundational to us understanding why we do what we do and how we respond to people, and why we find ourselves isolated. But your latest project, you've been working on for 5 years. It's a book called The Soul of Desire. So you wrote The Soul of Shame, and now you're unpacking for us The Soul of Desire, and the subtitle's Discovering the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty, and Community. I've heard you talk and riff on this over the last couple of years, but I'm so excited it's finally going to be in a form that everybody can grapple with this. So give us a bit of the synthesis of the big idea for The Soul of Desire.
Gabe, as I mentioned to you beforehand, this was a bit of a labor of love. This is a book that did not just immediately come forth. And so in many respects, what emerged over the course of those 5 years represents some of my own wrestling match, and that wrestling match with myself and with my own story. I'm 58, nearly 59 years old. And I'm even in the last, couple of years, last 6 months, last 2 weeks, have been wrestling with things afresh in ways that I never have. And, as as The Soul of Shame has kind of made its way and into the hands of people who've read it, and I've continued to sit with that, it really began to strike me over time that, and even though I offer a response to the experience of shame in that book, what began to grow in my awareness is that, even when this is true for much of our spiritual ill, we offer ourselves, we offer our friends, we offer our congregations, we offer cognitive answers to these things. And these are, we offer theological solutions, theological reflections about what the truth is about our life and our life in Jesus and so forth, all of which is necessary and true, helpful and meaningful. And at the same time, I've become just aware that, that over time, that it's not just when shame rears its head, we're tempted to just simply say, look, we have Good Friday, and we have the resurrection, and we have the ascension, and we have the consummation that is coming. And so that's all we have to know. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. And yet that doesn't seem to be enough. because I hear those words, and those words are true, but I hear them through my left brain, and my right brain, which is where my shame matrix often hides out, is left adrift from that. It's left isolated from that. And what I really need is community. And so we talk about in The Soul of Shame this notion that I want to have a cloud of witnesses that helps me tell my story more truly and looks upon me, and I can look upon them, and we can find freedom. But then what really struck me, and we see this in our patients, we see this in these cohorts, these confessional communities that we describe in the book, in The Soul of Desire, this notion that we were made as people of desire, as it turns out. And it turns out that shame, evil, makes shame a parasite on desire. We long for beauty and goodness. We were made this way from the beginning in the garden. But we weren't just made with the desire and the longing to be seen and to be known. It turns out we were made to be seen and to be known in order to then co-create, to create beauty and goodness in the world. It's not just enough for me to know and be known. I need that fundamentally. But I need that on the way to making things.
Right.
And that beauty that we long to make is not just something that I want to create in my environment as I steward my work, whether I'm making furniture or software or legal briefs or farming or whatever it is, or I'm making babies with my wife, or I'm like raising a family, or in it, whatever those things are. I'm also, the Spirit of God doesn't just want me to make things like He makes things. The Spirit of God longs for me to become the very beauty that I'm in the business of co-creating with Him.
This takes me back to the first time you and I met. We had coffee, Frothy Monkey here in Franklin.
I'm right there with you. I see it. Yep.
Andy Crouch had connected you and me and said, I bet you guys will be friends. And, I just remember sitting there and talking about this. And as you describe the idea of that we were made to create, it takes me back to Andy, who is somebody in this community who's one of the first to just talk about that God's just designed all of us to be a part of creating culture with Him, and that's how we make beauty. That's how we put things into the world that offset the evil and the destruction that happens around us, and that's how we repair things that are broken. So it's full circle moment as you described that this is what we're made for. This is how God's uniquely wired us. I mean, you've studied the brain. You understand when we come to life, when we flourish. I mean, this isn't just some idea out there. This is like built in. It's like baked into God's design for a human being, whether you're a Christian or not, that you've been designed to make things, to create.
Right. And here's the thing too, Gabe, that really strikes me about the gospel. It is not difficult for us when we come upon beauty, either in nature or in worship or in a magnificent painting or a piece of architecture. We come to it and we are just held in rapt attention. There's no question about this beauty. The newborn comes into the world and she's all bundled up and she's handed to you and you can't believe what you're seeing. But here's the thing about the gospel. The gospel comes looking for that kind of beauty in the very last places that we would expect to find it. There's nothing about a crucifixion about which the idea or notion of beauty would ever occur to us. If we knew anything about what the Romans did to people, beauty would not be on our radar as a way to describe it. But through the lens of Easter, we look back at Good Friday and we say, there is nothing more beautiful than a crucified Lord. And it is because of that we sense that Jesus comes looking for the parts of our lives that we hate the most. He comes looking for the very places where evil believes it has triumphed. And He is looking for beauty in the very last place that we would expect to imagine it. And He begins with us, and then He calls us and says, I want you to come with me, and I want to send you into the most broken places, And I want you to, with those people who are broken, I want you to help them begin to practice imagining beauty in their own lives where that's the last thing they could ever imagine.
Mm. Yeah, what a call to all of us. And as I think about just the moment that we're in culturally here in the U.S., and I know this is something people all around the world are experiencing right now, is just this new moment of needing to experience beauty, but perhaps it's going to need to happen in some ways that they didn't realize. And it's going to happen in some circumstances or locations or places where they may be left and escaped to go find beauty. And now that's not as possible as it once was. And they're faced with, okay, what does it mean to create beauty every day? What does it mean to be the kind of person that's, I know you talk about this, like create paths in your life that are intentional, that allow you to see beauty every day. Can you just encourage people right now who are going, you know what, I haven't felt like there's a lot of beauty around right now. I feel like the world's kind of caving in on me, or I'm feeling crushed by the confusion of trying to determine how to live my life right now. What are some of the ways people can think in maybe a small way about finding beauty?
Right, small ways, exactly. And I would say first, Gabe, that part of how it is that we feel crushed in this way is because we are, our kind of like, we might call it our mental or emotional or spiritual musculature that can effectively look for and discover beauty is pretty atrophied. We haven't had to practice using it. We haven't been in the habit of looking for beauty in difficult moments.
Yeah.
We can be taken by it. We can be captivated by it when it happens to show up because we're on a hike and I round the turn and there's this magnificent vista. But that's not the same thing as me looking for it on a regular basis, especially in the places that are difficult. And so this notion of practicing looking for beauty in places, this is part of the issue. Like, it's going to take work. It's going to require work. So one of the things that I would send people to, you might remember this. There was a movie that won an Oscar for Best Picture called A Beautiful Life.
Yeah.
And this tells the story of a father and his young boy who were taken off to a Nazi concentration camp, and what happens to them, and the life that this father creates for his young boy, because he is intentional upon creating a life for this boy that the boy otherwise wouldn't be able to see unless somebody on purpose is going to create this. And of course, people around him are like, "What are you doing? What are you?" But it is the very thing that keeps them both alive. And we see this in practical ways. And of course, our listeners at first glance might think, oh, this kind of all sounds rather odd. So here would be an example. I would suggest that you can do this. This is exercise every day for the next 6 weeks. I want you to, before you do anything else in your day, and of course, this is where people are going to have a hard time, because I'm going to ask them to do something that they're not going to want to do. I'm going to say, before you do anything with any device, when you wake up in the morning, your alarm clock goes off, you turn your alarm off, you get dressed, and I want you to leave your house. I don't care if it's sunny, I don't care if it's rainy. I want you to leave your house. And I want you to walk someplace where you live in which you can find something that is natural, that is emerging. That's a tree, that's a flower bed, that's something. And I want you to take 60 seconds, at least 60 seconds, and I want you to put your hand on the tree. I want you to look at it. I want you to sense it. I want you to feel it. I want you to pay attention to it. Now, of course, it'd be best if you're not doing this in your neighbor's backyard, because then things get weird.
Right.
But my point is that for us to make contact with the natural world, with the natural beauty, we begin to allow our senses to wake up to the reality that beauty is actually there.
Mm-hmm.
I just haven't been paying attention to it.
Right.
Instead, my attention is attuned to social media. My attention is attuned to other things that are not about beauty. They're attuned to all kinds of things that, in fact, are about the destruction and devouring of beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing like putting your hand on an oak or a maple tree that is immovable for you to be reminded that, like, you didn't put this tree here.
Right.
This tree is more durable than your body is.
It's going to outlast us probably, right?
It's going to outlast. And it literally, this is the thing, Gabe, it begins to speak to us through our right hemisphere of our mind, of our brain, and allows us to sense God's intention and his presence in ways that language and logic simply don't approach us. That's an example of an external thing to do. Begin to practice, do it once a day, every day for the next 6 weeks. And I would say, as you do, pay attention to what you sense and image and feel. That's one thing. Another thing, it would be important for you to begin to create, even in your home, anything that you want. Draw, paint, write a piece of poetry, write a lament, get online and say how to write poetry. And if it's been a while since you've played the piano or the guitar, pick it up and start to work at it. The very act of intentionally pursuing beauty and creativity in your alleged small life will begin to awaken your brain and your mind and your relationships to how much bigger your life is and that God is waiting for you in it.
Yeah.
And the next part, the third part I will say, that's just a practical thing, is I want to ask you this question. If you couldn't be ashamed or afraid, if you couldn't be ashamed or afraid, and right now you're going to say, like, yeah, but Curt, I got all kinds of reasons. Like, yeah, if you couldn't be afraid or ashamed, what would be the first next thing that you and God would want to create together? What would it be? Would it be learning how to cook a new meal? Would it be a new relationship with your child? What would it be? A new relationship with a friend that you'd like to be closer to? What about a friend who used to, what about an enemy who used to be a friend that needs to be repaired? These are things that we are called to do, but that we can't do them alone.
Yeah.
Who are going to be the people that you're going to contact and say, like, George, I just want to call you up and say, like, I decided that today, this is the project this next week that I'm going to create with God, and I want you to know about it. Now, we think, off the cuff that, like, well, gosh, this stuff all sounds like pie in the sky. I don't really know how this is going to work. And I would say that we don't have much confidence in these kinds of activities because we've never practiced them. We've never had to. And the reason we've never had to is because we are the age of the infinitely distracted and distractible. And every time I get distressed about anything, I just get to my phone. And then I don't have to live with my distress. I will just be distracted. And then COVID comes along and it reveals my fragility. In addition to causing my wounds. Beauty, I want to suggest, and the pursuit of creativity, not in the abstract, but in the context of relationships, is an answer to this that God is offering. And so echoes Dostoevsky's words in his novel, The Idiot, that beauty will save the world. And we would say, not least, the beauty that we see through the lens of Easter in the image of a crucified Lord.
Wow. Well, man, you've given us so much to consider, contemplate, and even to do. And as you're describing that first practice of just touching creation, last evening I took Kate and Joy, two of our children, out because we just bought 2 or 6 little baby chickens. And they're like the cutest, it's like day 2. So they're just fluffy, bright yellow. And, I brought Kate and Joy out to look at them, and, they're a little scared, and Joy doesn't want to touch them, and she's just kind of scared of it. And it's all unfamiliar. So I pick up one of those little baby chickens, and I'm like, give me your finger. And she watched me kind of stroke his little head as he kind of moves his head and makes his little tweets, and
oh my gosh.
And she finally sticks her finger out and lets me kind of take it and just put it on the little chick, and starts to stroke it, and she starts to smile, and the little chicken just does its little tweets, and she can kind of see almost this interaction between her touch and the chick's little noises that it's making, and then Cade got interested, and so I started holding him, and Cade thought it was the funniest thing, and thought it was so cute when I was kissing their little. But anyway, just when you were talking about that, it's like they're used to digital, they're used to a world of school and concrete and playgrounds, but not always getting to interact with creation and nature and these other living things, these beings that have been created. And so anyway, that was fun and a good reminder as you were talking about that.
Right.
Like,
well, our listeners wouldn't necessarily connect engaging with newborn chicks with the healing of racism, for example. they wouldn't connect putting your hand on an oak tree every day for 6 weeks with political polarization. But I want to say to our listeners that if we are willing to allow beauty, especially in the context of vulnerable community, which is a lot of what we talk about in the book. It's not just about a venture out into nature or into museums. It's really about the beauty that is created in the context of these communities that we describe, where people are really working through their deepest, darkest places to see them not as something we want to get rid of, but as beauty that is waiting to emerge in the gaze of those around them. When that's the kind of beauty that we are looking for. When we see that the ones with whom we have great difference are actually sources of new creation, beauty then is no longer just some abstraction that becomes a luxury in the world. No, but as von Balthasar would say, Hans Urs von Balthasar would say that beauty is where everything begins. Beauty is the way God draws us to himself, such that we know that that is good, such that the truth only then makes sense. And it's in light of that my longing is for us to have our imaginations stretched, which is going to take some work, into a space in which we don't just see beauty helping us feel better about ourselves. That's not what God's up to. He is about the redemption of everything, and not just the small things that we think are small, but the big things as well. And and he is asking us to be co-laborers, co-creating artists with him in that venture.
Well, such a deep and important message for all of us. And so I hope those listening, you're encouraged as you take this journey with Curt, leading us. It feels like we're probably sitting on the couch in your office, and you're helping us start to rediscover some things about how we've been designed, how God wants us to function, and how we can live, and how we can be the kind of neighbors that bring beauty everywhere we are, in our relationships, on our street, in the places that God's called us to be and to cultivate. So thank you for your work. Thank you for just your faithfulness. And I want to encourage everybody, get the Soul of Desire, Discovering the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty and Community. We love it when we can see science come together with faith. And Curt, you're doing that on a new podcast that we've launched together called Neurofaith. Why don't you give us just a moment? I mean, you've been having all these interviews, and tell us a little bit about what that's been like for you, just having those conversations.
Well, Gabe, I'm just in the spirit of this notion of creating beauty and goodness in the world. I'm just so grateful that, again, this is one of these things where, like, if it weren't for you and Rebecca and the Q community, like, I wouldn't be doing this, and the Q community wouldn't be able to hear these, the voices of these other neuroscientists, these other folks who are working in the field that have something to do with the mind. And so we're having the opportunity to create things, and along with Rob and Grace and the whole team, this notion that this podcast is an artifact of beauty itself. And what I'm so thrilled about is, there are a lot of these folks that are out there that are in the academy that are doing their work in such a way that it's somewhat limited, in that only really the people who are in the academy get to hear about this. And what's been so beautiful for me, even so far, is to have conversations with many of these folks who are doing work in research, whether it's on emotion, whether it's on the notion of even the emotional and psychological implications of racism, whether it's what does it mean for us to even think about what the mind is. And when we're talking with these professionals whose work in the trenches is about all of this, and then inviting them and us to talk about how does this really speak to what it means for us to be people of faith. It has been a joy to have these other voices, besides my own, these other voices who have so much additional language and metaphor and pictures and things to talk about that are going to help our listeners be, like you like to say, begin by enabling our listeners to be more curious about A, how their minds work, and B, how learning more about that really enables them to love God and love their neighbor and to create in the world that much more effectively. And so I'm just so grateful that, the Templeton Foundation and you at the Q Ideas have kind of locked arms on this and created a platform where over time there are going to be a lot of different voices.
Yeah.
They're going to speak to a number of different things about neuroscience and the way it is speaking into our world through the work of these folks who are really putting forth a lot of effort. And I have you to thank for that. So just great.
Yeah, well, thank you. No, it's fun to create together, and we love having you as a guide to take us on that journey of better understanding some of these deeper concepts that people maybe haven't considered. Curt, thank you again for all that you're doing, and it's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Gabe, as always, thanks so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Curt Thompson. He's amazing, such a depth of knowledge and information. I continue to grow just by the time I spend not only reading his books, but also beginning to listen to what he's doing in the podcast world. And I want to remind you guys, we have partnered with Curt to do Neurofaith, and that's going to come out early this coming year. You're going to be able to, in January, begin listening to his interviews of other leaders, really combining science and faith and helping us better understand how God's naturally wired us and our brains to operate and how faith informs that around a variety of issues from mental health to living well in this current moment. Well, you can find more content, some of our other conversations we've had around mental health with Dr. Curt Thompson on Q Media. You can get a free trial to that at qideas.org/trial. And also when you do that, you can have access to our Next Gen Summit. The Next Gen Summit is our event series that we just hosted this past fall with 200 leaders ages 18 to 30. And we invited 10 key leaders to be mentors to inform and educate these young leaders on how to think well about our current culture, about the big issues and topics of our time, and you will love that conversation. In fact, if you have a college student in your life or a family of teenagers or children or those that you lead might be in that age group, you would find this as an incredible way to create some incredible conversation. So I hope you'll join us at Q Media by going to qideas.org/trial. We hope you have a great week.